Answer quickly, who checks the United States Congress? We the people through elections, right? You're correct. The United States of America has checks and balances in order to maintain a separation of powers, right? The separation of powers between the executive, so the president, the judiciary, so the courts, and the legislative, so Congress. The courts can check the executive, and the courts can check congressional legislation, but they cannot check congressional action behaviors, right? Why? Because the courts aren't supposed to be political players. We, the people, voted in the congressional slate, right? Which means that although courts can have constitutional jurisprudence when it comes to actually enforcing any kind of change to Congress due to their behaviors, it's not the courts, but we, the people, who would do that through elections. But there is another alternative that we're going to talk about later. So there are only three authorized, codified branches of government: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, where Congress can check the courts, but the courts cannot check congressional behavior, unlike the fact that Congress can check judicial behavior through legislation. Then there is no authority within the Constitution to balance congressional power, right? Because the executive cannot touch the Congress. They can just give suggestions as to where policy can lead. But that check and balance has to come from somewhere. But the only three branches that are codified with authority and the Constitution are not in existence to where they're capable of checking Congress. That has to be the people. But we, the people, don't have that authorized codification into the United States Constitution. See, Amendment 10 is the least litigated amendment. Why? Because in actually interpreting expansion of codified rights of the people, you will be what? Reducing the authority of the state and federal government. So expanding the power of we the people in the Constitution reduces the power of government in the Constitution. And that is why they wouldn't want that. So the people check Congress, however, voting isn't necessarily a protected right, which means that it can be manipulated, and that's how we've been experiencing it, right? The people check Congress, yet Congress checks the people through voter suppression and gerrymandering, making it difficult to vote and actually hold them accountable. You see how this is not working. Why do you think that Republicans are at war with elections and they want to put barriers in order to make it more difficult? The accumulation of all powers, legislative, so through Congress, executive, so the president, and judiciary, so the courts, and the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So what this means is that one-party rule will mark a transition into that tyranny. So why is it that Republicans want Democrats to vote in bipartisanship when it comes to like the cabinet picks? Because it looks bad if it's only one party that's keeping the votes, right? So they want to force Democrats to align with them by seducing them with this policy and this policy or whatever. So they don't want us to see that it is a one party rule. So, and the Democrats actually aligning with them on policy, even if it's something small, even if it's something like a cabinet choice, that means that there is bipartisan acceptance in this transition into tyranny. But rather, we're told that were the federal constitution really chargeable with the accumulation of power, with a mixture of powers having a dangerous tendency to such an accumulation for tyranny, no further argument would be necessary to inspire a universal reprobation, so disapproval of the system. So why is it that Republicans are at war with not only voting but also intellectualism? The obstacles to usurpation, so violations, and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the government, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. You understand what that means? That we, the people, have to rise to the rising consequences that they're inspiring. So we have to be capable of fighting and defense of our rights, but first we have to acknowledge what our rights are. Since there's so much disinformation as to what America is, there's so much disinformation as to our political foundations and our political reality, and so much anti-intellectualism, it's been easy for us to be convinced contrary to our rights. Like the fact that you shouldn't be voting for your religious text, but you should be voting for the constitutional text. That is our constitutional reality. It doesn't matter if you have the freedom to be your religion or the freedom of speech. If the Constitution says this candidate is disqualified, you should not be voting for them. But the fact that they removed that knowledge from us, they made us, through intellectual disenfranchisement, they've been capable of honing an American electorate that is incapable of thinking through our constitutional duty to defend the Constitution and those values that it ingrains. But the natural strength of the people in a large community in proportion of the artificial strength of the government is greater than in a small and of course more competent to a struggle with the attempts of the government to establish a tyranny. Which goes back to the fact that knowing your power as a voter terrifies Republicans because they know that it is the people who get to check Congress. So they make sure that we don't have the protocols in order to be capable of executing that in a way that is much more in acceleration to the damage that they're doing. It terrifies them that you can see clearly now that the real answer to who checks Congress is absolutely no one but themselves. Only Congress can remove a congressional problem prior to elections, right? It relies on the good faith of those in Congress to check themselves. The power of we the people to have an authority to check Congress is not codified within the United States Constitution. Which is why when we have someone like George Santos, we have to wait until elections because how do we get him out? So what that tells us again is that there's no actual separation of branches. So the fact that only Congress can remove a congressional problem means that Congress checks Congress. And this, my fellow Americans, means that no, we do not have a separation of powers. We have bare minimum governance that through weaponized incompetence allowed for tyranny. Tyranny has perhaps oftener grown out of the assumptions of power called for on pressing crisis, so the crisis of the Constitution being challenged, right? By what? By woke, by the left, by liberal mentality, by LGBT, by DEI. By a defective constitution than out of the full exercise of the largest constitutional authority. So in this reality, we could have expanded the constitution to include a recognition of we the people as voters and also our voting rights, right? But that wouldn't benefit them. That's why they don't go beyond Amendment 10 because that would mean that they would reduce the power of the federal and state government. So why would you want to do that? So what's happening is weaponized incompetence because they're holding us hostage within a constitutional format that is insufficient so that they can maintain a political grasp through intellectual disenfranchisement where we are capable of voting in alignment with their own goals and agendas, right? And in this reality, while America isn't led by a king, it is led by whoever is in charge in Congress. And while sometimes we haven't been capable of seeing how terrifying this is in a reality where an extremist political party has won, we now know how that can be maximized and how that honor code that makes sure that there's at least some sort of independence in how they work breaks down because there's no actual guardrails that forbid it from happening. Because what? The reality that there is a lot of ambiguities within the Constitution allows for them to create a reality in which they technically have lawful mandate to be as incompetent as they want. And that's where we are, where voting is scary for them, which is why they want to keep it as to Congress is the one that checks Congress. But if that is true, then that means that we do not have a separation of powers. And if that is true, then that means, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but it means that whatever we become tomorrow cannot be what we were yesterday.